It's been a difficult month in a difficult year. COVID-19 shut down the global economy, driving the worst economic depression in the century. Where I am in India today, we're in the midst of one of the worst crises of our country's history, left to the mercy of a vicious government and a privatized healthcare system that has deemed, in this moment, just millions of poor not worthy of living. It's no surprise that we now have 40 new billionaires who got rich because of COVID. They made their money on vaccines, on medicines, on masks, on testing equipment, things that we needed to stop us from dying in the middle of the pandemic. Private hedge fund managers have had billion-dollar paydays, while some of the poorest countries in the world have paid more in debt interest payments than the cost of vaccinating their entire populations. So much of this is heartbreakingly familiar, right? This moment feels both new and confronting, and yet like much of the same. And now, with some countries ostensibly bouncing back and some economies ostensibly bouncing back, many of us are wondering what actually changed, what remained the same, and for progressive forces around the world, what is to be done? In short, where is global capitalism going? Today, we have two incredible members of our council coming together to discuss the crisis and what we, as progressive forces around the world, can and should do about it. We have Yanis Varoufakis, who is a member of the Hellenic Parliament, secretary of Mera 25, and co-founder of DiEM25, the Democracy in Europe movement. And the second speaker is Ammar Ali Jan, who's a historian and member of the Haqooq-e-Khalq Movement in Pakistan, an anti-capitalist organization that's working amongst farmers, workers, students, and women to build an alternative political project. To all of you, our viewers joining us from around the world, from different time zones, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the anniversary celebrations of the Progressive International.
The oligarchs ruling the world are pushing humanity to an existential crisis in every country, on every continent.
Our choice is clear. It is internationalism or extinction. But while wealth and power consolidate around the world, the forces of progress remain fragmented.
Nuestra misión es unir, organizar y movilizar las fuerzas progresistas
in a planetary front with the strength to fight and win. Our internationalism stands against imperialism in all its forms, from war and sanctions to resource extraction. We seek good ways of living, free from hunger and want, in harmony with all species of the planet.
Our internationalism is intersectional. We believe that layers of operations that run through the global economic demand that resented the struggles for food, for land, for dignity, and for liberation.
Nuestro internacionalismo es feminista. Nuestro objetivo es romper con el patriarcado y terminar con las estructuras binarias de géneros en las que se apoyan.
We direct our politics towards care, cooperation, and accountability.
Facebook has now turned into a beast.
Our internationalism is intimate. New technologies promise community, but sow discord instead.
We believe we cannot succeed unless we know and trust one another on equal terms.
We welcome unions, parties, movements, individual activists, and publications,
wherever they may live.
Together, this coalition is greater than the sum of its parts,
and powerful enough to remake the world. We believe that dialogue is not enough.
Our activities prepare us for planetary mobilization, matching the scale of our crisis to the scale of the actions we mount against them.
We believe that solidarity is not a slogan. The expression of sympathy is commonplace.
Our task is to join forces across borders in a common defense of people and planet.
And bend history towards justice. Join, donate, share.
We've had some trouble playing our anniversary video for you. Our apologies for that, but we hope you can see it on our Twitter, on our Facebook, and on our YouTube channel, where we're just celebrating our 1-year anniversary this month of May 2021. So honoring this anniversary of the Progressive International, our council members, Yanis Varoufakis and Ammar Ali Jan, will engage in a wide-ranging debate about the direction of global capitalism in a turbulent age, right, of crisis, of the pandemic, and of political unrest. The goal of these discussions is twofold. First, we aim to set the agenda for the Progressive International in its second year. So you, our audience, get to shape it today with your questions, with your comments and feedback as we engage in this discussion. How should we understand the crisis of today to work towards the world that we want to win? Second, we're asking for your help. We hope to raise enough money to keep us going for the entire year. As you've seen, we've brought you shows like this. Media from around the world in over 14 languages travel to Bolivia, Ecuador, and Turkey to defend the basic tenets of democracy and uphold political rights. We've stood alongside workers and convened the Make Amazon Pay campaign with transnational strikes and legislative action. And we continue to bring scholars and activists together in a common internationalist front. All of this was possible only because of you. We're funded exclusively in small donations by people like you. And we'd like to keep it that way, and we're asking for your help to remain independent. With these two goals in mind, I welcome our two speakers once again for an international, an internationalist, and an intimate conversation. Welcome, Yanis and Ammar. It's so wonderful to see you both again. Hi, Yanis. Hi, Ammar. Yanis, I want to start.
Hi, Ammar.
And I will, Yanis, you have the floor, passing the mic to you. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much. I am actually quite happy that there was no picture, because I always preferred radio to television. I always thought that radio produces the better pictures than television. So, we let our imagination, go on and on. Ammar and Varsha, it's a great honor to be with both of you. And in particular because, your neck of the woods is so intimately related to where I come from. In a way which is not evident, but it is profound. To begin with, let me say that, in terms of my academic career, I had an Indian supervisor when I was doing my PhD, and my first supervisee was Indian as well. While my roommate at university was from Pakistan. So, but besides that, your countries were the result of a breakup, a very painful division brought on by British capitalism. A division that has left its scars, not just where you are, in Kashmir in particular, and my solidarity personally to the good people of Kashmir that are suffering immensely on both sides of the border. But, if you think of what's going on in the Middle East, that partition was also the result of a breaking up misanthropic British Empire. Here in Greece, we suffered a civil war at around the same time, in the 1940s, that was inspired by British governments, both of the Tory and the Labour Party complexion. We have Cyprus next door to us, which was divided as a result of British attempts to keep Cyprus and to keep a huge basis near Nicosia, which they did. So, since Varsha asked me to speak and to introduce this discussion in the spirit of internationalism, I can't think of a better way of binding us together than by mentioning the common history of our places, as well as the place which is now burning in Palestine, to a common anti-imperialist war. So, Ammar, the floor is yours. I'm desperately eager to hear your views on what's going on, where you're coming from, this struggle which is eternal. Every generation is condemned to be fighting the same struggle again and again, or not condemned, privileged, let's say. So how are things looking on the ground where you are? And then we can go into perspectives on capitalism, or whatever it is that we call the present socioeconomic mode of production that we live in Pakistan.
Thank you, Yanis. And first of all, just a bit of a warning, there's a huge global digital divide. And we're sitting in Pakistan where the internet is extremely sketchy. So if there's ever a problem in the middle, my apologies in advance. Second, thank you to you and so many other wonderful people who are working with PI, who've educated us. We've been looking up to so many of our teachers around the globe who've been really carving out an alternative imagination to global capitalism. In Pakistan, the situation is quite difficult right now. We have what they call a hybrid regime, which is a mix of democracy and military dictatorship. And that's something very common, historically speaking, with Latin America and Greece that we share. And we have a government that is beholden to the IMF, which actually came to power saying that it will break the begging bowl. But at the moment, not only have we signed a really punishing deal with the IMF in 2019 for $6 billion, we increased inflation from 3% to 10%. There were cuts to government sector employees, to health, to 40% cut to education. But also something very interesting or very scary is happening right now, where the government is trying to make the state bank, the central bank, independent. So what they're doing is they're actually removing the bank from democratic pressures and handing it over to financiers. Right now, interestingly, the governor of the State Bank of Pakistan is a man called Raza Bakr, who was the same guy who was heading IMF's austerity measures in Egypt recently for General Sisi. So you can see how incestuous this global financial oligarchy is today, how interconnected it is. And they're using all these models of austerity that they're learning from the city in London, from New York, from Egypt, and bringing them to Pakistan, which is already an impoverished country. The result is we have negative growth rates for the first time in 7 decades. We have a really high unemployment rate today. Inflation, as I said, is 10%. Budget cuts to health and education. And not only that, as a response to this kind of very undemocratic economic decision-making, we are also seeing the rise of authoritarianism. I mean, the issue of enforced disappearances, for example, in a place like Pakistan is rampant. I came back from the West to teach in Pakistan, and I thought it was great to discuss ideas that friends in England and America used to discuss on campuses. And very soon, people I was teaching, like really sharp students who believed in a future, who believed in an alternative, they were being abducted by state agencies. They were facing terrorism charges. Many of my students went missing. And over time, I was accused of sedition. There's a case registered against me, which carries the life sentence. And I'm still out on bail. So you see this like increasing economic authoritarianism matched by political authoritarianism. So there is this militarization that we see of everyday life, of protest, of surveillance, the kind of surveillance that we see. And this, I think, points to the kind of future that is emerging all over the world, where more and more authoritarianism will be evident, especially for those living on the peripheries, because what's needed from the peripheries are resources, is land, is labor, but human beings and their dignity is no longer needed. So we're seeing an erosion of dignity, and the war on terror, which we'll talk about maybe in a bit, because Pakistan was at the heart of the war on terror launched by George W. Bush, that kind of exacerbated these processes, whereby it became very difficult to differentiate between a terrorist who was a terrorist of a terrorist organization and a student leader and a trade union leader and a farmer's leader or a doctor's leader. These charges of terrorism in a place like Pakistan have been used to quell dissent across the board. Students, teachers, doctors, farmers, trade unionists. One of our comrades, Babajan, from Gilgit-Baltistan, this guy who was working for the victims of floods in the area of Gilgit-Baltistan, which is in the Himalayas, was charged with anti-terrorism for demanding compensation for the victims of flood. He became a climate prisoner and remained in prison for 9 years. Just came out last November. Similarly, there was a movement in a city called Faisalabad of textile workers, where there was child labor and people, as usual, were not paid on time, and there was no job security. And when there was a general strike in 2011, the result was that 14 people were given life sentences, again using the legislation of terror. So we're seeing this mingling of law with this terrorism discourse. And this is why I think places like Pakistan are very important to study on what the future could be. And that's something I would like to hear from you as well, because I know Greece is European, but a bit like us in terms of being on the southern side of Europe. And it seems to us that democracy has been hijacked even in your country.
The process of revolving door rotation that you refer to, with the chap from the International Monetary Fund imposing austerity measures in Sisi's Egypt, shifting to Pakistan to take over the central bank. The central bank being rendered, so to speak, independent. There's no such thing as an independent central bank. It's only independent from the democratic process, from the demos, from any kind of control by democratically elected parliaments. And as you said, delivered into the hands of the financiers. This is a global pattern. It is the way things have always been. Look, Ammar, I just don't believe that we ever had democracy anywhere. So it's not that our democracies were usurped. I grew up in a dictatorship. And when the dictatorship ended, we had democracy, supposedly, which meant that we had elections. But the elections were only allowed to produce a government if the oligarchy didn't mind it. Anytime the oligarchy was upset by something, they managed to remove the people that upset them, or to remove the whole government, or, as in 2015, to make the government overthrow itself and, perform a lobotomy upon itself, with the Syriza government effectively adopting everything that it was elected to fight against. So let's be, a bit more historically nuanced. There has never been democracy. There was never any respect for human dignity, not even under the Raj, in your case, or in our case, in the 1930s, 1950s, 1960s, exactly the opposite. 2 days ago, we we commemorated the murder of a wonderful member of parliament of the left in 1963, if you remember, if those who are watching us remember Costa Gavras Zed, only because he managed to create a sense of urgency amongst the young that the peace process was important, that in the 1960s he was murdered in cold blood. So, I'm getting on in life a bit, sufficiently to resist the tendency to say that the past was democratic and there was human dignity. It wasn't. It was an awful place. One more aspect of your introduction, which I think is crucial, and I hope you don't consider me to be flippant on this. I heard you in horror, and I'm sure everybody else heard you in horror, speak of the court case against you, that you're out on bail, that your students have been detained. I'm sure some of them were beaten up as well by security forces and so on. This is all very horrific. But Ammar, there's something worse than that. Do you know what it is? It is when your country modernizes, like Greece was modernized at some point after the 1970s, 1980s. We made it, and so to speak, into the circles of the developed nations. We even got their currency, the Deutschmark, which of course has been metamorphosized as a euro, but it is still the German Deutschmark. And you know what was the worst aspect of it all? When I realized that my own students were so eager to become McKinsey's and Goldman Sachs employees that they jettisoned voluntarily their radicality. And, you know, occasionally I would manage to get to them through huge effort in the lecture theater, in the tutorials. And then, you know, something would wake up in them, some progressive force would wake up in them. But then 5, 6 years later, they would meet me, bump into me on the street, and they would say, "Oh, hi, Professor. You know, I really enjoyed your lectures. I mean, they were very inspiring. Are you still a left-winger? Haven't you grown up?" Yeah. You know, that's worse than then being detained, if you know what I mean. I know that this is a very controversial point, but the unfreedom that people choose in order to blend in to a world which is unsustainable is perhaps worse than living in a dictatorship. And I remember that when I was a 17, 18-year-old, I moved to England to study. And I remember I was participating in a picket line, metal workers strike, somewhere in Birmingham, Corby. And there was a union organizer there whose accent I could more or less not understand because he came from Yorkshire. And I was only 17, 18 from Greece. And, you know, we talked. He asked me where I was from, and I said from Greece and so on. He said, "Oh, yes, Greece, fantastic place. You know, you had a dictatorship. You had the student uprising in 1973. And like you now, I was explaining to them, you know, what those moments entailed in terms of the horror of the secret police, of people beaten up, of torture, of, you know, my relatives being imprisoned. My mother's uncle was sentenced thrice to death, you know, all that." And he turned around and he said to me, "Luxury, that's wonderful what you experienced." And I thought, what? He said, "Mate, you don't realize if the working class in this country," he meant England, "came in anywhere near to threatening the establishment, democracy would be banned in this country." So, you know, so in a sense, that's where I want to end this section before you take the button again. Look, we're in the same place. Whether we are in Pakistan today, in Greece in the 1960s and 70s, in Britain or the United States today, you have an ironclad establishment with their revolving doors of apparatchiks. They would fit brilliantly into the nomenclatura of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. You know, they look the same, they sound the same, you know, they have a mantra, they have a ideology. Whether it is a Pakistani, an Indian, a Swiss, a Swedish, a Nigerian, a Greek, or an American banker, it doesn't make any difference. If you catch them in Davos and you ask them, what do they think about the state of the world? They will sing from the same prayer book. It will be the same story. They are comrades. They show immense solidarity with one another. Every time they mess up and financialized capitalism suffers as a result, as in 2008, as it does now, you know, they manage to get together and push governments to, you know, print mountain ranges of money to give to them. And they are refloated at the expense of the precariat, of the proletariat, of the care workers, and so on. The one lesson is that we need internationalists because they are internationalizing and they show international solidarity towards one another.
Yeah, they're the strongest trade union in the world. And that's what's very scary. And, you know, I want to get to the question of, because I promised my friends on Twitter as well that you're going to talk about techno-feudalism. But right before that, there's one thing I can really relate to this idea of people willfully surrendering to unfreedom. And this is the tragedy of our times. Like in many ways, many people who are surrendering don't even know that they're surrendering. I mean, there's also like a linguistic crisis almost. Like people just absolutely don't realize what's happening, how decision making is being monopolized. And the idea, the value of life, of what it means to really live, what it means to encounter new possibilities, encounter what is deemed impossible by the system. This is what really gives humanity its drama, even its tragedy, even its glory. All of that is now reduced to the calculation of bankers and of finance and GDPs, and you know, you have to sacrifice for all of that. And this, I think, is a huge loss for humanity as such, not just for the poor, but also like for the middle class, even for the bourgeoisie. I mean, they are probably one of the most decadent classes. You know, recently I was reading an article by Balaba who said, you know, back in the day, at least the bourgeoisie had philosophers like Kant and you know, John Stuart Mill. Today, they are actually dismantling the education system and want education to be reduced to a technicality. So everything has to be about the market. What is the value of this in the market? What kind of a job will you give? And this kind of reduction of human thought, human emotions, human passions, human imagination to an equivalent in the market is a sign that we have entered a really decadent and declining phase of capitalism. And this is no longer a crisis, an economic crisis. This has become a civilizational crisis. And this is where your argument about techno-feudalism, I know there's a lot of technical debate about your claim, but I think it is so profound precisely because it really tells us that this is not capitalism how we understood it in the 19th, 20th century. I mean, there were actual enthusiastic supporters. Now people are like, we just have to do it. There is no alternative. So why do you have to do it? Who's forcing you? It's like, no, there's no other way. So if you could just tell us what is this techno-feudalism? And why does everybody think we have to conform to this absolutely stupid way of living life?
Well, let me start from the last part. Every status quo is reinforced by this cyclical thinking that because things are how they are, that they couldn't be otherwise. You remember that when Voltaire tried to, since you mentioned the old bourgeois philosophers, or the philosophers of the old ruling classes and upper classes, Voltaire was fantastic at just pinpointing that particular aspect of you know, human beings caught up in a regime by criticizing Pangloss. Pangloss was, you remember the character, who had a theory that we live in the best of all possible worlds. It doesn't matter how bad it is the best of all possible worlds. Any attempt to change it, to rewrite the script, would produce something worse. And unfortunately, you know, various revolutions have proven him right, even though he's profoundly wrong. So our job is to prove him wrong by creating alternatives that are actually better, and they are palpably better. But you asked me, you know, about techno-feudalism. Look, when I was growing up, when I was a young man, I remember the very interesting debates between those supporting capitalism, free markets, you know, competitive capitalism on the one hand, and the socialist camp of different variants that were arguing that markets, yes, they unleash huge quantities of energy, of human creativity, productivity, but at the same time, they produce new forms of depravity, new forms of misery. Crises roll out of the production line of capitalism, crises that debilitate whole generations in exactly the same way from the same production line that produces gadgets, cars, iPhones, and so on. That was a very interesting debate, right? The supporters of capitalism were presenting the market as a decentralized decision-making system where, you know, each one of us is doing whatever he or she wants on the basis of price signals. So, you know, you're producing bread. When a particular kind of bread's price goes up, that's a signal for you to produce more of it. You don't need huge bureaucracy to decide that that kind of bread needs to be produced. There's a very strong argument there. Then, of course, there were the Marxists and the Social Democrats who were arguing that, yes, this happens This may be so in the case of the bread market, but it doesn't happen in the labor market. It doesn't happen in the market for finance. Those markets have a tendency to crash and fall and produce huge quantities of both inequality and deprivation. This was an interesting discussion. What both camps agreed on was the fundamentals of capitalism. That capitalism was a system based on profit maximization of individual private sector profit. The Marxists would refer to it as capital accumulation based on surplus value. The liberals would refer to it as, profit that was a just reward for risk-taking. But it was, everybody understood and agreed, despite our huge disagreements, that capitalism is a private profit-driven system, which is based on markets and to some extent some competition. This competition can be competitive competition, like Adam Smith's baker, brewer, and butcher, or it can be monopolistic or oligopolistic competition, as it is between, the Ford Motor Company and General Motors. And that made sense. It was an interesting conversation to have until 2008. In 2008, a bubble of finance that had been built up since the end of Bretton Woods in the 1970s burst. I'm not going to go into a whole discussion. I could spend hours talking about what happened between 1971, when Bretton Woods ended. Bretton Woods, by the way, for those who don't know, is the first 20 years after the Second World War, where we had a managed, centrally planned capitalism with capital controls everywhere, with bankers that were rendered very boring because they were not allowed to do what they are doing today. They were only allowed to do bread and butter, lending, taking in savings and lending money. So, bankers were insignificant in the 50s and 60s because of this central plan imposed by new dealers who had controlled the post-war American central plan on behalf of the United States government in particular, right? So, but that crashed and burned in 1971, and you had a gigantic build-up of financial power. With capitalism, we had the shift of strength, of power, from the political sphere to the economic sphere, to the market sphere. With the period after 1971, financialization, you had a shift from the economic sphere, from the industrial sphere, the market sphere, to financial markets. And those financial markets created gigantic paper towers, which crashed and burned in 2008. Since then, we have two processes, and these are the two processes that determine techno-feudalism, or define techno-feudalism. The reason why I'm saying that after 2008, we don't really have capitalism. Capitalism has morphed into something else which I call techno-feudalism. Why am I saying that? Because firstly, in 2008, 2009 in particular, April 2009, the G20, the G7, decided together, coordinated, to have the central banks, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, and so on, including the Bank of India, and the Bank of Japan, and the Bank of Sweden, and the Bank of Switzerland, produce tons of money by which to refloat finance. And that started a particular process. When the central bank prints money, it gives it to private banks. It cannot give it to you and me or to people watching us because it can't. According to their own constitutions, they have to give it to the financiers. They're forced to do it by their own architecture. So the central bank prints money, it gives it to a private bank. The private bank, after a massive crash like 2008, 2009, especially when this socialism for the bankers, this money printed that goes to the bankers, is accompanied by austerity for the masses of people out there, the bankers looked at little people, small businesses, potential house owners or buyers, and they say, we're not going to give it to them. Austerity means that they will not be able to repay it with any degree of certainty. So what they do is they pick up the phone and they call the corporations. The corporations that they know and trust. And they say to them, look, I have a few $1 billion. Do you want it? We'll give it to you for free, 0 interest rates, because the private banks got it from the central bank at negative interest rates. So take Apple, for instance. Apple has $200 billion saved. It doesn't need money to invest. If it wanted to invest, it would have invested. It's got $200 billion smackers to do it. But the phone call comes from Bank of America and says, would you like a couple of billion? Free. So, you know, the CEO, the CFO of Apple, of Siemens, of Volkswagen, and so on, of Alstom, they say, okay, give it to me. And you know what they do with this? It's free money. So they take this money and it goes to the stock exchange. And Apple buys Apple shares. Volkswagen buys Volkswagen shares, and so on. So their share prices go up. The salaries of the CFO and the board of directors go up because those salaries are linked to the share price. No investment takes place. The power of financial markets and corporations goes through the roof. The real capitalist economy, the capitalist economy producing stuff, shrinks and degenerates. And we have, for the first time in the history of capitalism, we have zero profitability. On average, zero profits. And huge financial gains. For the first time, we have a complete decoupling of financial markets from... So, for the first time, capitalism is no longer driven by profits. So, in a sense, it's not capitalism anymore. If we agreed since the 1970s or 1870s, for that matter, that capitalism is a private, profit-driven system. That's the first dimension of techno-feudalism. The second dimension of techno-feudalism is that we no longer have even monopolies or oligopolies. You know, back in the day of the large first networked firm, which was Thomas Edison, producing electricity, light bulbs, everything from, you know, the electricity to the electricity grid to the electric oven, down to the electric lamp, right? This was a monopoly. But it was a monopoly. Amazon is not a monopoly. Facebook is not a monopoly. Because this is what really struck me as very distinct. If you have you go to a village or a town in Pakistan, if there is a monopolist of, you know, let's say there is one greengrocer who happens to be a monopolist. That's a terrible thing because he can push prices up, he can sell you rubbish vegetables, and you can get away with it. But it's not the same thing as Amazon. The equivalent of Amazon would be to walk into that town and to realize that every house, every shop is owned by one person, that the street, the soil, the mud is owned by that person, that the air you breathe is owned by that one person. That everything that you can buy and sell, not just vegetables, but everything you can buy in that town, is mediated through that one person. That person decides what you can buy and what you can't buy, at what price you can buy it. If you're a seller, you have to sell it through this one person, okay? And that this person also has a capacity to tamper with your brain or your eyes and ensure that you see what he wants you to see. You hear, because this is what happens when you're in Amazon.com or in Facebook. You don't see anything that Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos doesn't want you to see. So suddenly it hit me that, you know, this is not even monopolistic capitalism. This is feudalism, because only under feudalism do you have a fiefdom belonging to one person, one family, deciding what you see, and owns everything. But of course, it's a digital feudalism. It's a techno-feudalism. So techno-feudalism for me, and this is where I shut up and I conclude my definition, has these two planks, these two poles. On the one hand, it is predicated and kept alive by state money, central bank money, not private profits. And secondly, you have feudal-like fiefdoms where everything is controlled by very few people, and it's not a market anymore. It is something equivalent to a feudal situation. Now, that combination of central banks and the Amazons of the world, which is where we're moving towards, because you have local Amazons in Pakistan. We have them here in Greece. There are, you know, copycats operating at the national level, but also in the same way, where using digital technologies, they trap you into an environment which they wholly own. Okay, this means two things. Firstly, the complete end of any ridiculous notion that we may have democracy. Okay, that's number one. And number two, you have the total annihilation of the proletariat. The proletariat becomes a precariat. There's no chance you're going to have good quality jobs. There's no chance you will even have trade unions. And you know what? And here is where I link it to your question. Why do people take this for granted? Why do they assume that it can't be otherwise? Because the power of this techno-feudal creation is so gigantic that people submit to it. And as Marquis de Condorcet said once upon a time, the true secret of the feudal lord's power does not lie in his weapons and in his guards. It lies in the mind of his subjects.
Well, I've heard a lot of your lectures on this, and I would really encourage people listening to watch some of the lectures that you've already given on techno-feudalism for DM25 TV and other channels, because this really allows us to rethink capitalism. Like, you know, the way this has morphed into a system that is no longer premised upon wage labor, which also means that a large section of humanity today is disposable from the point of view of capital, from, you know, call it capital, feudal, finance, whatever the ruling system, however you want to nominate it, a large percentage of humanity can be deemed disposable from that perspective. And you know what every time when I read about your stuff, and you know, Professor Jody Dean has also written a lot about neo-feudalism in a more political register. I often think about the debates from the colonial world, where we've always had this debate over whether a place like India, Pakistan, or, you know, parts of Latin America or Africa, did they ever truly become capitalists? You know, because there was feudalism prior to that, or whatever different kinds of modes of production. And what colonialism did is it integrated us into this capitalist modernity without really leading to the same kind of accumulation process nationally. So, for example, in India, we had the British, of course. I mean, the root cause of a lot of issues in the world today. But you know, they were controlling. What they did is they didn't like actually change the everyday mode of production in a fundamental way. What they did is they took over the existing ways of doing labor, of producing, and linked it to the global market through finance. This is what, you know, this is what the British did in the 18th and 19th century through credit, by advancing credit to peasants and forcing them to produce for the global market, which led to more and more immiseration for the peasantry, without a national capitalist entity that could absorb them. So you had pauperization, surplus populations emerging, and you know, this is why the late 18th and then 19th centuries are known as the centuries of famines, despite the fact that India was at one point the biggest exporter to the world of a number of things, a number of commodities. But those commodities were actually leading to a reduction of nutritional intake for peasant families within India, because they were producing now for this abstract entity. And the interesting bit, the two really interesting bits here. One is that this entire process was naturally militarized. So, when you can't really give jobs to people who are not only being dispossessed from their lands because they can't pay the exorbitant rents to the state or to the British, then you have to put them in their place if they revolt. So we had these huge colonial bureaucracies emerge who were very anti-people in their essence. I mean, anti-people in a way that's very different even from the West. I know bureaucracies are not liked anywhere, but here we had bureaucracies that didn't put money into education or health, did not give us citizenship. So there was no citizenship in our part of the world till the mid-20th century. Even someone as liberated mentally as John Stuart Mill said, you know, Indians are not ready, and Africans are not ready, and you know, the brutes are not ready for democracy, and so there's a limit to liberalism. So we were in this, you know, what one intellectual has called the waiting room of history. First, we have to be civilized, and then we will participate in the modern global sphere. Till then, we have to just like accept this kind of brutal appropriation of our surplus. So that's the one interesting thing, which is why we're still haunted by militarization. We're haunted by communalism, because they weren't dealing with citizens. They were dealing with communities. They categorized Indians as communities, and they did the same in Africa and to a large extent in Latin America as well. And the other interesting thing is, and this is where I think your point becomes very interesting, and someone has to do more research on this, that the forces that were leading this entire process were not just British, the British state. Of course, it was central. It was actually companies, the East India Company. So it's like, you know, today you're just talking about Amazon. And so it's almost like this new process that has happened, that a company, Facebook, Amazon, Google, are more powerful than anybody else, all states. Here you have the East India Company controlling an empire bigger than the British Empire till 1857, because till 1857, India was not ruled by Britain, by the crown. It was actually ruled by the company. So it's like officially, formally, British came to power in 1857 after the War of Independence in India. But of course, the British were subsidizing the East India Company. They were sending their soldiers to fight for the East India Company. So this was a company that had completely taken over Britain's foreign policy. And someone, even a conservative like Edmund Burke, was horrified by it. He thought this would like destroy any semblance of democratic discussion, because you have a company that has too much power. So, you know, when I listen to you, I often think when Marx said industrialized countries show other countries their mirror image or their future, maybe we can reverse that by saying, you know, it's actually like the colonial world, which showed the future to the rest of the world, which was this kind of neo-feudalism, this extractive kind of economies held by global finance, backed by these powerful militarized states. And this is what is happening in large parts of the world. And one thing that it leads to is the fact that decision-making is no longer where it should be. It's no longer in the parliament, even judiciary. The judiciary is now being used by all these big companies for lawfare against people like, you know, Lula da Silva, people even in Pakistan, others. So law is, even the judiciary is very much, you know, hijacked, and the militaries and the media. So the state apparatuses have been already taken over by these very global forces. And I'd just like to briefly mention two things. One is that just the scale of this, of what's happening, what you're saying. I mean, it's not just that it's Amazon is an American or a Western problem. This financialization is something that is destroying countries across the board. I mean, look what's happening in Lebanon. 40% of the banks are now controlled by politicians. It's not like the politicians have become more powerful. It's like bankers have become politicians and are controlling politics in Lebanon, which is why they put this ridiculous WhatsApp tax last year, which led to an uprising. I mean, in Indonesia, they are bringing this bill, which is called the Job Creation Bill, which actually is, it really reduces environmental and labor regulations in Indonesia in order to create jobs. I told you about Pakistan, but like also if you go to India, what's happening with farmers, where farmers are now being integrated into the global market, so that so that people in the global north, this tiny elite, can access their commodities cheaply. And you know, they've been protesting for so long, and you can go on and on and on. But what's interesting in all of this is that all of a sudden, whether it's the governments, the militaries, the media, the analysts, all of them are saying that this is necessary for the financial health of the nation. So this sacrifice is necessary for our financial health. It's like this idea of national sacrifice or of sacrifice for humanity or religion has merged with finance. So all of a sudden, finance has like a theological dimension. You can actually sacrifice. You know, what do you do when you cut spending on education? You're sacrificing the future of millions of young people. That can be done for the financial health of the nation. This is the most boring theology. I mean, theology can be so interesting. I mean, I know I've read your stuff on Greek mythology. Mythologies can be so interesting, let alone theology. This is complete nonsense, where you are completely creating these sacrifice zones around the globe. And I'll end this by just saying that you know, there is now, in these movements, you can already sense this absolute desire for an alternative to emerge. That, you know, this system is no longer enough, that it's not working, and something new has to. We are really in the end times in a very palpable manner all across the world. So in that sense, I'd say, you know, the initiative that you have taken and that we all are a part of, and I hope, you know, our viewers will join if they haven't already, is just the fact that we have to create a counterpole to what is happening at the moment. Because if finance, if right-wing nationalisms have become globalized, internationalized, we have to have an alternative today that also rises to the challenge that we face today. Because, you know, otherwise we are facing phantoms across the world. In places like Pakistan, you have the emergence of right-wing religious rationalisms, where it's all about this critique of the West, which is a very essentialist critique of religion, of race. In the West, we have people who are Islamophobic or anti-immigrant. So before the creation of monsters, as Gramsci would call it, we have the creation of phantoms that are used by monsters in order to discipline populations. And a left-wing alternative, an alternative that really says that the party is over, and we need to move on to something that radically rethinks existing coordinates of our existence, is absolutely necessary. And here's one thing that I would like to ask you in terms of the alternative. We all are so angry, and we have, you know, it's been so difficult. What is the alternative, Yanis? How do we actually start imagining an alternative to this failing order?
This is the billion, trillion, quadrillion dollar, euro, rupee, whatever question, of course, isn't it?
Yeah, you can answer it.
Look, yeah, I know. To begin with, let me say that this kind of exchange that we had in the context of the first anniversary of the PI confirms the importance of the PI, confirms the importance of, you know, coming together from Pakistan, Nigeria, Latin America, Greece, America, North America, Europe, and so on. Because the alternative has to be internationalist, it has to be global, it has to be based not just on good feelings that we share amongst each other, but we need to have a common program. You know, the financiers have a common program, the fascists have a common program. You know, Modi on the one hand and Bolsonaro and so on, they have a common program. We need a common program. And what should that common program be? Because, you know, we're coming to an end. I'll just be very epigrammatic as to what we need. What we need to salvage from the left, even in this era of post-capitalism, which I call techno-feudalism, is the emphasis on ownership. The left has wasted a whole century worrying about income redistribution. Now, of course, it's a great thing to redistribute income, but it's not enough. And it can't work if you preserve the architecture of capitalist, post-capitalist, technostructure, whatever you call it, the architecture of the mode of production, with a tiny minority that own means of production and a huge majority that work the means of production without owning them. If you preserve that, however much you redistribute income, you know, the bastards will keep coming back to power and knocking down, you know, Bretton Woods, social democracy, the welfare state, whatever. So I think that the essence to your question has to go back to something you already said before. You mentioned the East India Company, the British East India Company. Well, let me remind our viewers that, our listeners, that it was in 1599, at the time when Shakespeare was writing Hamlet, that company was founded. And the great innovation about it, and the reason why it became such a menace and such a force to be reckoned with, was it was the first time that a company did not have a cartel-like structure, but instead its ownership was divided in a very large number of small pieces of paper, each one of them tradable anonymously. The first share market, the first anonymously traded corporation. This is what unleashed all this lethal power. As you said, Ammar, they had 200,000 soldiers that conquered India. It was not the British state, the English state that did it. It was the East India Company that did it. It created not only an empire and colonies in your neck of the woods, but it turned England, as you said, as you intimated, into a colony. It effectively corrupted government, it took over government, and it treated working class English people and Scottish people and Welsh people just like they treated the Indians in the Raj. They treated them like colonial subjects. And also allow me to make to agree entirely with you that what the British did in India is effectively render India, Pakistan, your area, your geography, render it a remarkable precedent for what's happening today in the West. Because the process you described of authoritarianism, of extraction without capitalist development is now what we see in the Midwest in the United States, is what we see in the north of England, it's what we see in Greece, it's what we see in Italy, and what we see in East Germany, in large parts of West Germany. So this techno-feudal turn is bringing to the forefront power structures that the British East India Company had created in your area. And we need to be radical. So what should we aim for? The end of share markets. Nothing short of that is going to bring about a genuinely progressive world, a world in which we can enjoy freedoms and save the planet. We need green Keynesianism. And I've invested most of my life working out green Keynesian projects here in Europe and so on how to arrest huge amounts of liquidity created by financialization and press it into the service of the green transition, green jobs, and so on. This is green Keynesianism. We need it. It's a stepping stone. But it cannot be the objective. The objective must be a situation whereby, I keep saying that in the last couple of years, because I think that is the only thing that can really unite us and inspire us to move forward. Use green Keynesian techniques in order to come to a point where corporations belong to the workers working in them on the basis of one person, one share, one vote. No one should be able to own any part of any company unless they work in it. And simultaneously to democratize central banks and give a digital bank account to every citizen, every resident, not citizen, every resident of a country where there is a jurisdiction by the central bank, in order to cut out the middleman, the private banks. So if you end the financial markets and share markets, then the world is our true sustainable oyster.
Well,
I had to fit in a very large vision in very few minutes because I am very mindful that the time is passing.
I know.
Obviously, we need to say a lot more about it.
Yeah, we're going to wrap up soon. So, well, you've written about it a lot, and you've, there's a lot of YouTube videos of you explaining your ideas. But thank you so much for sharing some of those with us today. And I encourage everybody to really follow some of these debates, because this is something that left across the board is talking about today. Someone like Richard Wolff in America, who's talking about workplace democracy, to Yanis Varoufakis, who's talking about workers creating becoming share owners. This is like a global discussion on how to rethink the economy, rethink global capitalism, and turn it into something that no longer is serving some abstract entity that we all for some weird reason have to surrender to, but actually is oriented towards meeting the needs of humanity. The two biggest of which are, one, meeting the challenges of the pandemic. The pandemic is not over, as Varsha was saying in the beginning. What is happening in India right now, what's happening in Argentina, what's happening in so many other parts of the world is absolutely horrific. And this is one thing that especially friends from the West must remember. This idea of a post-COVID situation is a Western
can I butt in just 1 second?
Of course.
Because there's an important datum that needs to be mentioned here, because there's a lot of discussion about patents and pharmaceutical companies, which is all fine, because I would like to see all of them socialized, like I would like to see the rest of the corporate sector socialized. But there is one piece of data that people have to keep in their minds. Since the beginning of the pandemic, our Western central banks have printed $9,000 billion, $9,000 billion, and given it to the financiers, free, zero interest rates. That's 9 trillion, $9,000 billion. The International Monetary Fund, which sometimes says interesting things and then forgets about them, only 3 days ago came up with an estimate of how much money it will take to vaccinate fully every human being on the planet. It's 50 billion. So they've printed 9,000 billion and they've given it to the financiers, when 50 billion would have ended the whole story as to how you pay for the vaccines. Even before we start talking about socializing, nationalizing, internationalizing, whatever, the patents of the pharmaceutical companies. I just wanted to add that because I think it's important to make people furious by juxtaposing what they've already printed, money they created out of thin air, and what would have taken to vaccinate the world.
Absolutely. And, just to add to that, this idea, because of this kind of skewed preferences of central banks, of governments, and also those who control it, which happen to be mostly the global north, this idea of a post-COVID world is what I just want to end by challenging. That, this idea of a post is very much a Western fiction that's been there for a long time. Post-feudalism, when feudalism never really ended for much of the world, and now it's haunting the West itself. Post-war, Second World War, no. Cold War was actually a time of immense destruction caused through proxy wars across the non-European world. Post-Cold War was a time not of end of war, but all kinds of military operations, whether it's the war on terror or Yugoslavia or other parts of the world. And post-COVID is not going to be a post-COVID world, really, because in places like Pakistan, we have 2% of our population that's been vaccinated, and we're the 5th largest country in the world. And India is not doing way better. Other countries aren't doing way better. And Joe Biden is opening up the economy on the 4th of July, and he thinks it's a post-COVID world because he monopolized the world's vaccines. But we have to really understand, what really does it mean to be in a post condition? Whether it's really a Western figment of the imagination of the global North and the West, or whether it's really something that's post. And I'd like people to really think about what Yanis has talked about in terms of where our resources are going, just like ending it by saying, this is a moment in which not just the destruction caused by global capitalism has become very pronounced, but also the thirst of people across the world for alternative is at an all-time high. I've never seen so many people really wanting an alternative, especially young people. From Palestine, we've seen young people come up who are really talking about an alternative, Latin America, Africa, South Asia. And this is the time to bring a manifesto that is both sensitive to the local conditions of each particular region, but is also ambitious insofar as it talks about a global restructuring of the economy. And this is what Progressive International is trying to do. It is very sensitive to the local conditions, and it is ambitious in terms of proposing something that is global. So please subscribe, join, and donate if you can, because this is the kind of insurgent alternative, our alternative to the world ruled by financiers who could not care less about you and me and a vast majority of humanity. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Ammar and Yanis, for such terrific discussion. There's very little that I could add to what both of you have so beautifully and so articulately laid out today. As as we look around, certainly from where I'm sitting in India, but what many of the authoritarians today in the world are doing, from Turkey, Hungary, our two countries, Ammar, Pakistan, and India, is they've taken up the language of the future, or at least certainly futurism for themselves. And this is obviously what is the language of capitalist modernity, right? And simultaneously, they've painted much of the left discourse for land, for rights to land, rights to water, rights to food, as belonging to the past, as a thing of provincialism. And if there's a task for the left today, and I'm seeing a lot of this in the comments that have been coming in as well, I think it's really to build on what, Ammar, you talked about this, about a very real existing thirst for resistance, for disobedience, and to continue to fuel our movements with energy. And I don't think this discussion could have done that any better than both of you have in the last hour. So thank you so much for that once again. And I want to thank our viewers, all of you, for joining us, staying with us for this full hour and a few extra minutes, for tuning in, for commenting, and continuing to engage with us. This discussion is part of an ongoing series for our anniversary celebrations at the Progressive International. You can sign up for the rest of the events on our page. You'll see it in the YouTube description. You'll see it on all of our social media channels on Facebook and Twitter. So please join, become a member, and donate. And if you like what you see here today, you should subscribe to both our YouTube channel as well as our newsletters. And please do consider, Ammar has already said this, but let me add on, please do consider making a small donation today. Every rupee and every euro counts. And thank you so much once again.